Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Joseph S. Nye, Jr., who is University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His new book is The Future of Power. Joe, welcome back to our program.
It's nice to be with you again.
What was your goal in writing this book?
Well, I've been trying to think about power for the last couple of decades since I wrote a book called Bound to Lead and invented the term soft power, that book, 20 years ago. I thought it'd be interesting to try to look ahead 20 years and ask what are the great power shifts of this 21st century and how do we understand them? And that basically is the thrust of this book.
And so how long did it take you to write this book? Working on it for 20 years, but...
Well, in one sense, you could say it took 20 years. The ideas gelled, but in another sense, the actual writing was a year. But I taught a course on this at the Harvard Kennedy School before that. I find teaching is a great way to make yourself clarify your ideas. If you have to explain them to smart students, you realize how you need to do a little extra work to clarify what you're thinking.
As a theorist of IR, international relations, help us understand what you're trying to do in a book like this. You're trying to help us understand what power is, but also in the context of a world that's really changing. So in the last 25 years, we'd had the fall of the Soviet Union, then we had 9/11, among other events. Talk a little about that and how those events kind of influence the way you grapple with this material.
Well, the traditional way of thinking about power in international relations was summarized by the great Oxford historian A.J.P. Taylor. Then he said the mark of a great power is the ability to prevail in war. Well, you know, that's not necessarily the mark of a great power anymore. In an information age, it's as important whose story wins as whose army wins. And if you think of some of the big changes that are going on, many of them can't be dealt with military power alone. Doesn't mean military power is unimportant. It remains important. But if you think of old items like, or issues like climate change or cyber terrorism, who do you bomb? If you don't know who's attacked you when electrons cross your border, where do you direct the cruise missile? And if you're trying to reduce the carbon intensity of growth, how do you do that with military means? So I guess what struck me was that in an information age, more and more things were crossing borders outside the control of governments, what I call power diffusion in the book. And we weren't adapting our thinking about power to just to that.
Early in your book, you tried to give us a conceptual framework to look at the different domains where power is exerted. And you talk about a three-dimensional chess game. Explain that to us.
Yeah, well, power always depends on context. Power is the ability to affect others to get what you want. And you can do it with threats of coercion, sticks. You can do it with payments, carrots, or you can do it with attraction and persuasion. And that's what I call soft power. And what's interesting is that what produces power, whether you get what you want, depends on different contexts. So if you think of power today of having three very different contexts, like a three-dimensional chessboard, top board of military relations among states, the United States is the only superpower. It's the only country with the ability to project military power globally. And it's probably going to stay that way for another couple of decades. Go to the middle board of economic relations among states. The world is multipolar. This is where Europe acts as one, and when it does, its economy is larger than the American economy. And China and Japan and others play an important role. So the second board is multipolar. Go to the bottom board of this three-dimensional game, the board of transnational relations, things that are crossing borders outside the control of governments. Power is chaotically distributed. bankers, terrorists, what have you. And to call this unipolarity or multipolarity is a category mistake. You're taking ideas that matter on one board and apply them to another board where they don't matter. And it also means that if we are trying to make changes on this bottom board, we can't do it by ourselves. We have to get others to work with us. You can only manage these non-governmental processes, transnational processes, if you have cooperation of other governments. And that's where your soft power comes in. You need to be able to organize networks, create institutions, persuade others to join in common endeavors.
Looking at the evolution of your thinking, you were an early theorist with Bob Cohen of transnational relations. Talk a little about the evolution of that, because it was there that you saw early on that the emphasis of the realist notion on military power wasn't helping us understand a lot going on in the world.
I think that's right. I don't denigrate the importance of military power of a realist view, but it just doesn't capture enough. I mean, it's a good place to start an analysis, but too many people end there. It's interesting, Bob Cohen, my close colleague and collaborator for many years, and I were both asked to join the board of a journal called International Organization in the late 1960s. And people would write articles about formal institutions or so forth. And both Bob and I said, we should really be thinking about international organization with a small I and a small o, about what are the things, including networks and relationships that cross borders, not just what formal structures there are. And so we were challenged to do something about that. So we edited a special edition of the journal called Transnational Relations in World Politics. This came out around 1971, but what's interesting, looking backwards, is it had chapters on multinational corporations, on terrorists, on the Catholic Church, on international social migrations. It was a different perspective of what was happening in the world. And then we followed that up a few years later by writing a book together called Power and Interdependence, asking in the aftermath of the oil crisis in the early 70s, where people thought that this had changed everything from geopolitics to geoeconomics. And what does power mean when you're dealing with these transnational relations, and particularly with economic relations? So we have been thinking about this for some time.
And in the beginning, when the complexity wasn't as apparent as it's clearly become today, there seemed to be a greater either realism or transnational relations. And I think what you're saying in this book, in fact, I think you used the term somewhere, liberal realism, right. Basically, yeah.
I think these categories of liberalism and realism, which are certainly the introductory categories for most textbooks in this, are just inadequate. As I mentioned, realism, which is that states are the only significant actors, that military force is their major instrument and security is their major goal, that's not a bad place to start an analysis when you have independent states. But if you stop there, you're going to miss most of what's going on in the world. Liberalism tends to emphasize things flowing across borders economically or sociologically and institutions, but that also misses some of the role of states, and particularly of military power among states. So I use this term liberal realism as a way to try to destroy the old categories, or not destroy them, but indicate that you need to merge them, not to assume that the world is either or.
In the early part of your book, you build a framework for thinking about power, and you touched on it a minute ago, but let's walk our audience through this. In other words, when people are talking about power, what has emerged in the literature are three ways of thinking about it, starting with Dahl, right, and then moving on. Talk a little about those three things, because that's what really gets us to the soft power, which you've talked about.
Well, there's sometimes people call this the three faces of power. And if you look back on the social science literature about power, it really goes through these different phases. But when Robert Dahl wrote his very important book on power in the late 50s, he said power is the ability to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. That's a good definition for power in some circumstances. If I can make you do what you otherwise didn't do, then I have power over you. But Bachrach and Baratz, who were political scientists who wrote in the early 60s, say, wait a minute, Dahl's missing something. Suppose that I can set the agenda so that your issue never comes up in the first place. Then I don't have to get you to do what you otherwise wouldn't do. So if I can set the agenda so that your issue never gets on the table, that's another form of power. They called that the second phase of power. Then a little later in the 70s, Stephen Lukes, a sociologist, said, well, there's still something else missing, which is not just whether I can twist your arm or whether I can set the agenda to exclude your issue. Suppose I can influence you to set your preferences. So you want what I want. If you want what I want, I can save a lot on carrots and sticks. And so that third phase of power, which Lukes introduced, goes to the establishment of preferences. So all three of these are dimensions of power. Not one isn't right or wrong, but all too often you'll find analysts who will stop with number one. They'll say power is only when you can get somebody to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. Excuse me, if I can get you to want what I want, then I can save on carrots and sticks.
Now you have helped us understand what soft power is more than anyone else, in the field, and tell us how soft power really draws on, especially the second and third.
Right. Well, soft power is the ability to get the outcomes you want without coercion or payment. Essentially, it's through attraction and agenda-setting traction and persuasion. And I came upon this thought when I was writing this book, Bound to Lead, 20 years ago. At that time, there was a great belief that America was in decline. My friend and colleague Paul Kennedy wrote The Rise and Fall of the Great Power, saying the United States was going the way of Philip II Spain or Edwardian England and so forth. I didn't think this was right, and I was writing a book to say why I didn't agree with him. And as I was thinking about it, I looked through American hard military power and I looked through American economic power. So there's still something missing, which is the ability of the Americans to get what they want through attraction and persuasion and setting the agenda. And that led me to develop this idea of soft power. And it's an important part of foreign policy, but when we talk only in the old-fashioned terms of basically twisting arms, we miss the crucial role that plays in our foreign policy. So as I was writing this book, I asked, why is it the Americans are more influential than they think? And yes, our military and economic strength is a large part of it, but there's still something else. And that gave rise to the idea of soft power.
And soft power seems to have the quality of that it's harder to get your handle on it. That, military power, you go to war, you win or lose and so on. But it seems that now we're so overwhelmed by the places where soft power really become very important.
Well, soft power is hard to get your hands on in some ways, but it's also worth remembering that hard power can be illusory as well. If I have 10,000 battle tanks and you have 1,000 battle tanks, there's a tendency for us to think that I'm 10 times stronger. But if we're fighting in a desert, that may be true. If we're fighting in a swamp, I may not get the outcomes I want, as the Americans found in Vietnam. So we shouldn't assume that hard power and military power are so easily measurable. Power always depends on the context. Soft power often grows out of a country's culture, where the culture is attractive to others, or its values when they live up to their values, and its policies when the policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others. That's a little bit more ephemeral. It's not something you can drop on your foot or drop on a city. That's sometimes called the concrete fallacy, that power is only things that are concrete. Soft power may often have a more intangible aspect of it, but not only. I mean, for example, if you have a successful military, it can produce hard power by winning victories, but it also can produce soft power. For example, in the Indonesian tsunami case in 2004-05, the U.S. Navy delivered tsunami relief to Indonesia, and that had a big impact on the standing of the United States. Give you a concrete set of numbers on that. In the year 2000, Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, 3/4 of Indonesians had a positive view of the U.S. After the invasion of Iraq in May of 2003, that went down to 15%. After we helped use the military to provide relief to the Indonesians with tsunami, that went up again to about 40%. So you can have a resource like the military, which is tangible, which can produce both hard and soft power. It's that behavior of changing preferences, of attraction, so forth, that is crucial for soft power behavior.
Now, you have also come to help us understand what you call smart power. Mm-hmm. So that with all these faces of power, we still have to think about what makes a difference in realizing the power potential.
That's right. It'd be nice to think that we could solve everything by soft power or by hard power, make life a lot simpler. And there's some circumstances where soft power doesn't do much good. It's not going to change Kim Jong-il's nuclear program, for example. But there are also some places where hard power won't do any good. For example, the case I gave earlier of how do you respond to a cyber attack? You can't bomb your way out of that. So if you try to ask what most of the application of power looks like, you're going to have to combine hard and soft power resources, and you combine them in different ways in different contexts, which is going to be more successful in a strategy. That capacity to combine hard and soft power for a successful strategy in different contexts is what I call smart power. And it's interesting, it's a term that was picked up by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She called it using all the tools in your toolbox.
You actually provide us with an analysis of where, of the questions that somebody who's trying to implement smart power has to answer, really.
Well, you have to ask, what are your objectives? What are the target of your power? What are their objectives and preferences? What are the instruments you have available? How suited are these instruments for the particular context in which you're working with this? And as you try a strategy, ask what are the probabilities of it succeeding? And if it doesn't succeed, then you ought to go back and ask whether you started with the right objectives. You may have to adjust your objectives. So there is in the last chapter of the book, I do have a section on how do you think about a smart power strategy.
You're somebody who served in the government, and you've been dean at the Kennedy School, which focuses on policy. So central to your theorizing about international relations is coming up with policy relevant concepts. So how do you see your theories here helping policymakers sort out the world that they're living in?
Well, I try to right for academics and policymakers at the same time. I try to make sure that my concepts are theoretically grounded and clear, but I also try to express them in language that's accessible without a lot of jargon to policymakers, because I want to have ideas affect the world. And in that sense, I think it's important, and this is something we do stress at the Kennedy School, is to try to combine the academic rigor of the university with a sense of policy relevance. It's interesting to me to see ideas that I start with in an academic sense become relevant. This idea of soft power I developed as an analytic concept to solve a puzzle. Why were the Americans more influential than people thought at the time? It was fascinating to me to see that by 2007, the president of China, Hu Jintao, told the 17th Party Congress of the Communist Party that China needed to invest more in its soft power. And friends who are experts on China tell me there are over 800 articles in Chinese about soft power. And China is now spending billions of dollars on trying to increase its soft power. So here's an idea which went from an analytical origin to a policy effect, not just on the U.S. government, but on another government.
And the concept you're suggesting really helps leaders understand or articulate what they may be doing as a result of the way international affairs is changing, and they have to act.
I think that's right. Let me contrast for you two secretaries of defense in the Bush administration. In 2002, I gave a lecture to a group of generals at an Army conference, and I talked to them about the importance of soft power. And later in the conference, Secretary Donald Rumsfeld appeared, and one of the generals asked him what he thought of soft power. His reply was, as reported in the Financial Times, was, "I don't understand it." And that had a cost in terms of policy. For example, when he wanted to send the 4th Infantry Division across Turkey to invade Iraq from the north, we had lost our soft power in Turkey by lacking legitimacy of a second UN resolution. The Turkish parliament said no. We had to send the army down, the 4th Infantry Division down through the canal and up through the Gulf. They were late to the war. There's a case where failure to understand soft power undercut our hard power. Contrast that with his successor, Rumsfeld's successor, Robert Gates, who in 2007 gave a speech in Kansas City in which he said, "We need to spend more on soft power." He said, "There are just too many things today which the Pentagon can't solve by itself. We need a partner." He said, "I'm here to plead for you for more resources for the State Department. You may think it's strange to have the head of the Pentagon come and ask for resources for the State Department, but that's the nature of the world the way it is today." Those two different secretaries of defense in the same administration illustrate why it's important to understand concepts like soft power.
Now you say a smart grand strategy must understand very different distributions of power in different domains and understand the trade-off among them. So in addition, conceptualizing helps a policymaker think about, well, what power is there in this realm and how does the power in one realm feed into the other?
That's right. I mean, if you have the world's strongest military, as we do, it's tremendously important. If I'm thinking, for example, of deterring Chinese in the South China Sea, my naval power is tremendously important. That's a very traditional one-on-one. But if I'm thinking about how am I going to maintain stability in the international financial system, then I have to ask not just how do my Navy affect things, but how is my capacity to manage my own budget deficit, how is my capacity to talk to and influence other countries in the group of 20, going to allow me to organize diplomacy here. It's a very different context than, let's say, the South China Sea was. Then if I go to this other dimension, let's say cyber attacks, I'm not going to solve that by carrots or sticks. I'm going to have to figure out how do I organize in ways in which I can get a better understanding and cooperation, or to switch to another topic like that, climate change. If I see that China is now the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, and China's building 2 new coal-fired plants every week, that does damage to me. But I'm not going to send a cruise missile against the coal-fired plants. I'm not going to embargo China's trade, which would hurt me as well as them. I have to figure out that by helping China increase the efficiency of its growth to reduce its carbon intensity, I empower China, but I empower myself at the same time. So in that context, I need a very different set of instruments and a very different strategy. So each of these domains are different areas, requires a different mix of resources.
Before we talk about some current events and try to relate these theories to those current events, let's talk about 2 problem sets. First, most people talk about power transition and focus on the decline of the U.S. and the rise of China. Talk a little about that problem, because you're making clear that may not be as important a problem as what you call the diffusion of power, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah.
Well, power transition, which is a shift of power among states, is something we're familiar with. We've seen it throughout history. Power diffusion, which is the shift of power away from states and governments to non-state actors, that's more of a novel or unfamiliar territory. But power transition still matters. The trouble is the narrative we use to explain it is the traditional narrative that there's a hegemon and a rising state, and the hegemon declines, the rising state overcomes them. This creates fear, and that creates war. And that's a very familiar narrative in the literature on political science and international politics. I mean, it goes all the way back to Thucydides. And when he asked, why was it that the Greek city-state system tore itself apart, the 5th century BC, it was because of the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And World War I is often attributed to the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. And there are some analysts today, colleagues, who say this will be the story of the 21st century, that the rise in the power of China will create fear in the U.S. and lead to a great conflict in the 21st century. I think it's not right. I think it's also bad history. Bad history because Germany had passed Britain in overall economic strength by 1900, and I don't think China's about to pass the United States for decades. So that gives us more time and means we have to be less fearful, and we can arrange a better transition than we've seen at other times in history.
This focus on American decline has a strong constituency in the United States, and it's really linked to this whole problem of getting our domestic act together and dealing with a lot of the domestic problems that we have. I guess where I'm heading here is the cacophony of voices in a vigorous democracy like ours really leads to a tendency to confuse all these dimensions and not sort them out.
Well, the word decline is a fuzzy word. I mean, it can be absolute decline or relative decline. Absolute decline would be something like the fall of Rome, which people often refer to, which incidentally took 3 centuries from the peak to the decline. But Rome was an agricultural economy which was stagnant. There was no productivity. It had no great economic growth. And it was torn by internecine warfare. And that led to decay internally and absolute decline. The United States, I don't think, is in that situation. We have major problems with our budget deficit and our debt and with improving our education, which we have to deal with. But we're also, as the World Economic Forum shows, the fourth most competitive economy in the world after Switzerland, Sweden, and Singapore. China, incidentally, is 27th. And in that sense, we're also an economy which is at the forefront of new technologies, nanotechnology, biotechnology, or Web 3.0. And we have some of the best universities and best R&D and best entrepreneurial culture. This is not absolute decline. On the other hand, if you look at will other countries, not only China, India, Brazil, and others, get closer to us? Will they reduce the gap between the United States and these other countries? Sometimes it's called the rise of the rest. Yes, you could portray that as relative decline because the gap is smaller, but the rise of the rest is a better way to put it, because even as the others get closer, the U.S. may remain the most powerful country, which I happen to think it will. So it's important not to mix up absolute decline and relative decline, and it's even better not to express it as relative decline, but to talk about the rise of the rest and therefore the need for new strategies for us to deal with that type of position.
And that's where these different dimensions of power become very important, because what we really have to think about is a transition of some sort from sole emphasis, say, on military power to a greater emphasis on understanding the complexity of soft power.
I think that's right. I mean, the traditional theories about hegemony put too much stress on who's number one. They're not all that good historically. In the period after 1945, the Americans had a nuclear monopoly in about half the world's product. And even in that context, we couldn't stop the, in quotes, loss of China. We couldn't win the Korean War. A little later, we couldn't win the Vietnam War. It's not clear that hegemony explains very much. I think the problem, though, is also that hegemony has sort of this image of we're king of the mountain, you know, and we give orders down the cascading down the mountain. I think what we're seeing in the 21st century, in an information age, is the image is better expressed not as hegemony or king of the mountain, but being in the center of a circle. And you have to attract others to you, to work with you to deal with these problems. And that's why I think this old narrative of hegemony and decline gets in our way. Gets in our way because instead of asking, you know, are we slipping down the mountain or somebody creeping up the mountain closer to us, if you think instead, are we attracting others in this circle using our soft power, using our capacity to develop networks, to develop institutions, that's the right way to think about power in this setting.
In your book, you emphasize the importance of the diffusion of power, and you do a beautiful job of sort of laying out a framework for understanding this cyber domain. Let's talk about that. Why is the diffusion of power so important to understand?
Well, if you ask what's happening in the world today, the reduction in the costs of computing and communication has just made information so plentiful that it has changed the structure of who can do what. You know, as I use this metaphor in the book, that computing power declined 1,000-fold in the last quarter of the 20th century. If the price of a car declined that rapidly, you would buy a car today for $5. Anytime something becomes that cheap, the barriers to entry are reduced and everybody can get in the game. In 1975, if you wanted to communicate from San Francisco to Johannesburg to Moscow and to Beijing simultaneously, you could do it, but it was expensive. and you needed to be a government or a large corporation. Today, anybody can do that for free with Skype. I mean, this is just a very big change. So it's not that governments are out of the picture. It's not even that governments are not the most powerful actors on the stage. It's just that the stage is a lot more crowded. And that means you're going to have to rethink how you're going to exercise your power when you're dealing on a very crowded stage with information-empowered actors who previously were priced out of the market.
You provide a framework that helps us understand the cyber domain in terms of, at one end of the spectrum, a part of the domain where states have greater control, to another end of the spectrum where the individual with what you call a light network has more freedom of action. Explain this. You make a distinction. I'm trying to remember it. It's on really the infrastructure and who controls it versus the information itself.
Well, there are two mistakes you can make thinking about power in the cyber domain. One is to assume that governments aren't the most important. The other is to assume that governments can do everything. If you take that latter view, you might strive for cyber superiority. It makes sense militarily to think, for example, of naval superiority. Sure, they're pirates and so forth, but the U.S. Navy basically has superiority in naval matters. In the cyber domain, it doesn't make sense to talk about cyber superiority or to be able to dominate cyberspace, because we don't have enough control over, if you want, the pirates or the others. But the opposite mistake is people who say, the cyber domain, everybody's equal. They're not. There's a wonderful New Yorker cartoon from the 90s that says, it has one dog sitting in front of a computer talking to another dog, and says, well, first dog says to the other one, "Don't worry, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." And that was quite a prescient cartoon, because it does mean if you're attacked in cyber, you don't know whether the attack came from a hacker or from a criminal or from a terrorist group or from another state. And they may, if they're clever, route it in such a way so that you think it's one of the others. And some people have said, well, that means it's all equal. Well, no, it's not. I mean, not all dogs are equal. Some are bigger and bite harder and have more resources than others. So I try in the book to delineate what are the different power resources of different actors between these two extreme positions. Let's
talk a little about what's going on in the world in the context of some of these theoretical insights. And the first thing that comes to mind is what the extraordinary events in Egypt, where youth, students, the unemployed, essentially were able to use the technologies of Facebook, Twitter, to actually not only communicate, but organize and bring down a government.
No, it really is a fascinating case. The conventional wisdom about Egypt used to be that you had no choice. You either had to support Mubarak, the autocrat, or you wound up with the religious fanatics of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was no middle. This enormous burgeoning of information over the last 20, 30 years or so has created a new middle. And those are the people we saw in Tahrir Square. Not only did it create these people, but it solved their problems of coordination and collective action by giving them devices like Twitter and Facebook to coordinate. And so that is a very different type of politics. And it's not the whole story of politics. The army still plays a crucial role. I mean, if the army had decided to shoot, as in places like Libya or Yemen, it might have had a different outcome, or Tiananmen Square or Iran are cases where armies did use force. But in Egypt, the army held back. Essentially, the army had hard power, but the Tahrir Square demonstrators had the soft power of the narrative. And now what you're seeing is a bargaining between these two forces. We're in Act One of a long play. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but it is interesting that it's very different from the dramas that we thought of 10 years ago, where there was only, on the one hand, the autocrat, and on the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood.
You've thought a lot about institution building in the international realm. How do you think about institution building in a place like Egypt, putting aside knowledge of culture and history and so on, but really, do you have any thoughts about how you make the leap to the institutionalization of this protest movement? So what was an actor in bringing down a government will be an actor in building a government?
Well, that's going to be a crucial question for what Act Two of this play looks like, are the people who were so good at using social media in coordinating opposition, can they use those and other techniques to create political parties? And the elections are now scheduled to be held after the constitutional referendum in Egypt, but if they're held too soon, this new group won't have developed enough institutional capacity. So one of the interesting questions of the next steps in Egypt are, will they have enough time and enough skill to develop institutions that make democracy really work? Democracy is more than elections. Democracy is not electocracy. It's having a civil society with institutions that can express different views in a peaceful way.
If we look at the response of the Obama administration to the fall of Mubarak, we see an ambivalence in defining the situation. And it really is interesting because what we see is movement from an emphasis on security. Mubarak is our ally. He is a pillar of stability in the region, toward notions of democratization and support for movements such as this protest movement in Egypt. And what's striking is navigating that transition in the way we see that region required smart power, using your term, but it also the complexity at that point where we hadn't decided to really support fully the democratization, we wanted to keep Mubarak, it in a way undermined our soft power during that period. Talk a little about that, because there's a very complicated transition going here.
No, and it's going to make foreign policy a lot harder in a global information age. I mean, foreign policy, you have to reconcile different interests to try to get as much as you can, of as many of them as you can. So Obama clearly had interests in dealing with the Egyptian government, the possessors of hard power. We wanted to keep the peace treaty with Israel and the peace process intact. We wanted the Egyptians to help balance Iranian power, is another example. At the same time, he wanted to, or we in our foreign policy, want to appeal to these younger generations in Tahrir Square. And that's where the narrative and soft power comes in. If you want, focusing just on Mubarak would have produced short-run stability, but long-run instability. And so for the long run, you needed to have a narrative which appealed to this next generation. Trying to traverse that chasm, if you want, or it's like walking on a tightrope. And I think, yes, the administration wobbled on that tightrope, either risking tipping over one way or the other prematurely, but by and large they crossed it. I would say they crossed it successfully, and I would say that was a smart exercise of power.
And now in this second phase that you talked about, it's really about bringing our resources of soft power to help the new Egyptian democracy emerge with vigorous institutions.
Well, and we have to be careful. The U.S. government can't solve the creation of democracy in Egypt. I mean, the Egyptians have to solve that. On the other hand, if you look at institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy, which supports efforts by both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to work with Egyptian civil society, that's played a significant role, and it can continue to play a significant role. There are other things we can do is try to help bring in more private enterprise to provide jobs, which are going to be crucial. We can also do things where we help AID programs can help in particular instances with building institutions, whether it be universities or others that can help provide this stronger civil society. And American civil society, private sector, universities, foundations, and so forth can also help. We have a strong interest that this new generation in Egypt succeed. It demonstrates something which is tremendously important, which is that the Al-Qaeda narrative that you must use violence against innocents to destroy the old order is not the only alternative narrative to having an autocratic government. And so if this succeeds, it's going to be tremendously important. But it's also true that much of it's outside of our control. And that's just the way the world is.
Another case that we've been confronted with in recent times was the WikiLeaks phenomena. And again, this is part of the world that you're describing in your chapter on the cyber domain. What does that tell us about this information age, and what is the responsible response of a state like the United States?
Well, the ability to steal state secrets is as old as human history. But in the past, you sent a spy somewhere, and he or she might have carried out a briefcase full of documents or State Department cables. Now you have 250,000 State Department cables from all around the world exfiltrated on I think it was a Lady Gaga disc, and instantly spread around the world. That's very different. And we've spent an awful lot of our time assuming that WikiLeaks, the organization, or Julian Assange, the individual, is the problem. Basically, Assange and WikiLeaks are a symptom, not a cause. I mean, if Assange had never been born, something like this would have happened anyway. What we should be doing is directing our attention not at trying to find grounds for prosecuting Assange on the theory that he was in possession of stolen property. After all, so were the major newspapers, but on better monitoring our databases. We should never have had that many cables on a network to which some 500,000 people had access.
And one wonders, in the case of WikiLeaks, whether some of our initial reactions, because it's a new phenomena, what do we do about it, lead us to undermine our own soft power, because we are the home of civil liberties, of freedom, and so on. Do you have thoughts about that? Because I guess what as our leaders react to this new world that's emerging, some of the responses are based on what the most powerful institutions in the country might see as the way to go, and they haven't adapted yet to the complexity of these new realities.
I think that's right. A number of senators, for example, called for prosecution of Julian Assange. If you could prove conspiracy, Assange might be prosecutable under our laws.
If he had actually induced
the private to
leak the data.
But if they can't prove that, the next step was to try to prosecute him on the grounds that he was in possession of stolen property, but so was the New York Times. So was any newspaper that published anything about this. And once we get into that business, we are beginning to undercut our own deep values. So essentially, that would undercut our soft power. In addition, we have made a point of trying to stand for freedom of expression on the internet. And a number of foreign countries have pointed out that it's a little bit hypocritical for us to have the Secretary of State giving a speech about freedom of speech on the internet and then to prosecute Assange, unless you can prove that there was a conspiracy, which as far as I know, we have not yet proven.
The one other case in the news today as we do this interview is obviously Libya. Is that a case where that we seem to have used smart power well? The situation is evolving, so we don't know where it will go. And if it is a work in progress using smart power, how do we manage the cacophony of voices who haven't read your book or can't relate to the complexity of the situation?
Well, Obama, I think, has handled it well so far, but again, we're early in the game. Humanitarian interventions are dangerous because you start with good intentions, but you may have unintended consequences that are quite opposite of your intentions. So it's important as you go into a humanitarian intervention to be quite specific about what you're doing. It looked like that Gaddafi was going to slaughter civilians in Benghazi, and I think the United States, as signatories to the UN resolution on the responsibility to protect innocent civilians, had some obligation. People say, well, it wasn't a vital interest. True, but humanitarian interests may not be vital, but they are important. And in that sense, I think Obama was right to recognize it, but he was also right to wait until he had the soft power of legitimacy that was created by the Arab League resolution and the UN Security Council resolution. And then further, he said that there would be no American boots on the ground, and the Americans were not necessarily taking the lead and would be there for a limited duration. Those strike me as smart sort of ways to try to bound the problem so that you don't go in for a good motive and wind up with a mess. Somalia would be an example where we went in to provide humanitarian relief and wound up with Black Hawk Down. So again, this could go wrong. Libya might wind up divided between an east and west. It may be prolonged. But I think the way Obama has tried to bound the problem in his initial actions is an exercise of smart power.
How well do you think our institutions will make valid judgments of a process like the intervention in Libya? Because, again, we have the cacophony of voices. We have really the media doesn't do a good job often of explaining to us the nuances of what is involved. So will the measure be success if the mission succeeds, if we're able to get out, if a democracy emerges over time? Is that the way we're going to judge what has been done? And if there are other ways, what are they? How do we educate people, the Congress, and others about this complexity? And what is a reasoned, nuanced response in the short term? Yeah.
Well, setting your goal or objective as creating democracy in Libya may be a bridge too far. What Obama said is that he was trying to protect civilians in Benghazi from being slaughtered. And I think I would hope someday there'll be democracy in Libya, but I'm not sure that we're going to be in a position to create it, and certainly not by force. So I think it's important to be clear what the objective is. Yes, we'd like to be rid of Gaddafi, and the president has said that, but not by our military force, not by American guns, but protecting civilians from being slaughtered by Gaddafi. Yes, that is within our ability, and thus far, it seems that we were able to protect Benghazi from what seemed to be an imminent takeover by Gaddafi's forces, with the threat that they would be merciless. So I think it's important to make clear what your objectives are. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, that I have in the last part of the book, is a smart power strategy is clear in its objectives, and when it looks like you can't achieve those objectives, you go back and revise the objectives. So I would not revise these objectives to expand them to having American troops produce democracy in Libya. But there's a broader point that you raise about how we understand these things. In our understanding of power, we tend to think very much still in hard power terms. I mean, it's what we can do with the military, and there are some things you can do with the military and some that you can't. But in the American iconography, we have two different competing icons. One is the Lone Ranger going in and shooting up the place, and the other goes all the way back to John Winthrop in Puritan days, which Reagan adapted and brought up to date, which is the shining city on the hill. And to promote democracy, sometimes going in like the Lone Ranger and shooting them up, as we did in Iraq, may be less successful than to live up to our own values and to be a beacon for others to try to emulate or be attracted. So it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to save civilians from being slaughtered, yes, you need the use of military force. To create democracy, I think you probably have to rely less on democracy coming out of the barrel of a gun than coming out of that beacon from the shining city on the hill.
Well, on that note, let me show your book again, because I think it's very clear that it really lays out a framework for understanding a lot that's going on in the world today and will be going on in the future. Joe, thank you very much for coming back on our program for this very interesting discussion.
Well, it's a pleasure, Harry. I always enjoy it.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.